Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in just a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heijmen. We come to you every week to explore a few of the places where we currently see grace, and its absence, playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. Glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Well, it's been a minute. I'm so happy to be back with you, and the reason we're a little bit delayed this episode is because a hurricane came through and battered Houston, Texas. Sarah, what is that like? I know that there's probably a lot of PTSD about weather-related events in Houston.
Well, to be fair, we thought it was going to batter Houston, and praise God, it did not batter Houston, although it really hit Louisiana.
Yeah,
it's weird. We've gone from being a people who wait to the last minute to shut things down to being a people who shut things down like 3 days early. That's really what the PTSD looks like here. So, yeah. Pray for my cousin Clara. I never do this on the podcast, but Clara, they still don't have power and they're in rural Louisiana and they've got 4 little kids. So I just, there are people that are really struggling right now. That's the weird thing about hurricanes is there's some like when a tornado comes and you're so terrified. I mean, I grew up with tornadoes and you think like, oh, maybe it won't hit us and maybe it'll just go away. And sometimes that happens. With a hurricane, like, it's gonna hit somebody. You know what I mean? Right. So it's like this weird feeling of being so relieved and also feeling a little guilty that like someone else is gonna have to endure it.
Huh. So, sounds a little like Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Jesus is a hurricane.
Someone is gonna have to endure it. I hope it's not
How is that not in a Bob Dylan song? Okay.
Oh gosh, RJ, you're usually right in the path now. You've moved out of one path into another path of major weather events.
That's exactly right. We seem to just enjoy hurricane locales. I mean, we still do own our home in Houston because, around the time we moved, oil hit, less than $0 a barrel. And we're like, maybe it's not time to sell right now. Maybe we're...
Right.
So we have really good friends of my youngest brother just happened to move from Connecticut to Houston with their 2 girls. So they're renting out our house. But then I had all sorts of like, oh my gosh, massive... Yeah, we were worried because we still have a house there and we're not there. And like, are our windows going to blow in? How are our renters going to do? But they were very smart. I texted them. I said, hey, I know the hurricane is coming. Let me know what I can do to be helpful. He's like, oh, we left for Austin last night. I was like, well played. Well played. So
just leave.
I'm so thankful that it was not a big deal because Harvey, man, I have PTSD from afar. That's what 53 inches or 58 inches of rain will do to you. That was a crazy time. So, yeah.
Well, speaking of crazy times, you just dropped off your eldest son at an institution of higher learning.
We did. Which was intense. On the way back, my wife turned to me and she said, I kind of feel like I'm finally an adult. I sent a kid to college. I did it. And he's such a great kid and I'm happy for him and he seems pretty happy, but it's certainly not what any of us experienced freshman year. All of his classes are online. It's hot as Hades in Austin. It was like 105 degrees yesterday. So he's kind of, I don't want to say stuck in his little dorm room, but kind of stuck in his little dorm room and only half the kids are back and all the fun stuff that he would have done in a normal freshman year, the big opening celebrations are not happening and
he can't make out with random girls.
Well, hopefully, I don't know. He did. One night he's so sweet. We start getting these bing, bing, bing on our phone. It's like 4 a.m. and it's him texting us because he had just been out and walked around campus with some people. He's like, I met this girl and she's really cute. She likes me. She's from Miami, which is right down the street. So he actually does seem very happy. But
welcome to Miami.
Yeah, but it's strange, man. It's strange days. And our house he's got such a big personality and our house feels a little emptier. than before.
He's also big. Like, it's almost like
He takes
it's
up
the
a lot of
worst
220
analogy
pounds.
ever. But when our Bernese Mountain Dog died, the house felt empty. And I imagine that's what it's like to send a giant kid to college.
It is.
Exactly like that.
Marshall,
It's
Was that insensitive?
Marshall, gosh, last night we were snuggling in bed as he was falling asleep. And, at his school, he calls all his teachers Miss, so it's Miss Devon, Miss Merriam.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to us, you could call me Miss Marshall because I miss everyone who's left. I miss.
no,
I know. I was
RJ.
like, oh.
Oh gosh.
So he's 3 years old. I mean, Jackson's
brutal.
like a god in his eyes.
Oh,
And-
100%.
And now,
Well, I tell you what, we've had our boys in school for a week. I don't miss them at all. I'm so. It's amazing how much guilt is this sort of low simmering guilt that you feel about them watching screens or not getting enough
Yeah.
time or
Yeah.
just not learning their brains and to know that at least something approximating that is happening elsewhere that you're not in charge of. I mean, there's almost a new, maybe for it's just neurotic types like me, but there's almost like a new guilt that sets in, not only about the people who aren't in the position where their kids can't go back to school, but it's just more just like, is there something I'm forgetting? It's like you're on the way to the airport and you think you've forgotten your passport or something like that, because it's become ingrained that like my kids are my nonstop responsibility in my eye line, and this feels like maybe it took this to just be this pandemic for me to be grateful for something as basic as just school attendance. I mean,
totally, 100%.
that was very much taken for granted in a pre-COVID world, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
I just have so much freedom about what I'm sending in for them to eat for lunch, because I got to tell you, I have
Lunchables?
spent the first, yes, it's Lunchables. I spent the first decade of motherhood being like, they'll judge me if I send in Lunchables. I can't send in lunch. I got to make stuff. And I was like, who wants to order 20 Lunchables when school started? Because those last for like 8 months. I don't know what they put in them, but it's not good. And my kids are eating them. And I have that has been like Lunchable guilt is gone post-pandemic.
No more Lunchable guilt.
In the pandemic, but yeah, no more Lunchable guilt. Freedom in Christ.
Freedom in Christ.
Freedom prize.
Well, we're going to jump in now to our articles, and one of the things let's begin by talking about colleges, because I work with college students here in Charlottesville. Sarah works with college students at Rice in Houston, and RJ just sent a child to college, and then this college reopenings is very much a national news story right now, especially as it relates to students opening and then closing, because students cannot seem to not socialize.
Touch each other.
Let's just put it out there. There was a fascinating piece that was sent to me by Ginger Mayfield, who works with college students as well, or getting kids into college. It was in the website Inside Higher Education, and this is called Blame Game by Greta Anderson. She says, asking students, especially those who are 17 or 18 years old, to, quote, be adults, neglects decades of research on how young people evaluate risks and rewards. Kenneth Elmore, associate provost at Boston University, called such messages, quote, incredibly condescending and not motivating for students to follow the rules. Lawrence Steinberg, a professor of psychology at Temple University and a leading expert on adolescent behavior, said that young adults tend to think more of, quote, immediate rewards rather than long-term consequences, and they have a unique need to socialize with others. Even if college-age people understand the risks and consequences for breaking the COVID-19 rules, they also tend to believe they won't get caught, Steinberg says. Strong punitive approaches to bad behavior are, in his mind, quote, futile and, quote, not likely to work. When you have a temptation that is very immediately enticing, especially at this age, you often behave in a way that sets aside what you know you should be doing, Steinberg said. Julia Marcus, the Harvard epidemiologist, said punitive public health efforts, quote, don't deter high-risk behavior. They tend to drive that behavior behind closed doors. And then back to Kenneth Elmore at Boston University. He said, I've, quote, got my fingers crossed that Boston University's positive campaign, not punitive, will be effective in preventing such situations. She said, I may be naive, but I've been at it for a long time. I know what motivates young people, and they don't need a bunch of old people wagging their fingers at them. They don't tend to listen to that. Now, this is a very awkward situation. I think I'm sitting here in Virginia, and they've got an incredibly sophisticated psychology department that understands exactly what motivates people and what doesn't motivate them, and yet they seem to be ignoring all of that research and just shouting, "Stop!" at people. Just don't do it. And then
when in doubt, accusation and law.
When in doubt, accusation. And you read things from like Temple and Purdue that are saying like, if you break this, you do not have a place here. Like you are sayonara. And so this is what I was trying to connect with some sophomore students who've just gotten back, and I was texting them and saying, guys, I'd love to hear how the summer was and what's been going on. And so I get the first text back from a guy who says, actually, well, I'm camping right now because I got COVID and I had to quarantine for 2 weeks, but I'd love to see you when I get back. Then the second text comes in and the guy says, actually, Dave, I'm so glad to hear from you, but I'm quarantined because me and my roommates all got the Rona. And then I thought, this is, come on, we're supposed to be doing better than this. It's a week in, less than a week. And so the third guy texts and he says, actually, Dave, the majority of my apartment building just tested positive for corona, so we're quarantined for the next 2 weeks. And I just thought to myself, guys, that did not take long.
Anytime at all. No.
Anytime at all. And it's a real thing. It's not just a media narrative. All these kids have corona, and they're right down the street. And the punitive measures,
the people of Charlottesville must
basically did not do anything. So the law. Yeah. What do you guys think?
I mean, I would have followed none of these rules in college. Mm-hmm. None of them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would follow them now. I keep thinking of like a seminary retreat I think I've talked about before where it was a silent retreat for 3 days, and I immediately started wearing the craziest clothes I had and passing notes to people to get them to talk. And by like the second night, somebody like was like, there's a bottle of bourbon at the river, pass it along. And it was like over. I mean, and we were adults. Like the person who like had the bottle of bourbon was like my dad's age, you know, like it was like, I think this is a lot to expect of people. And I'm deeply empathetic because these students, I mean, I've spent time with a bunch of them this summer, you know, on the Zoom. And they're really suffering. They really miss each other. They really, you know, they've been cooped up with their parents, and their parents have a lot of rules about rules that they, you know, they didn't. I mean, it's weird to have to enforce rules on your kid when they're 20, right? And they're home. But there was a lot of that dynamic happening. And then they come into these university settings, and I don't know. I really feel for them. I mean, I don't really know what the answer is. One of my favorite things in this article is the sentence, phone sex is in.
Oh, yeah. There are quite a
phone
few.
Phone sex is never in, okay?
I thought that went out in with the ads in the back of Village Voice.
Exactly.
It feels like they're being set up for failure
It's such a mixed message. It's so impossible. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Well, it's yet another example. The fact that the problem with people's behavior is not that they don't know what they should do. It's that it's a question of actual capability. It's what we talked about with Giles Fraser. It's a crisis of capacity. It's none of these students, they know that they are risking their spot, that parents won't get refunds if they get, but there's other motivations that are stronger than those.
Absolutely. And it's more than just like they want to party. I mean, like, I think that's like the overwhelming narrative. Oh, well, they want to party. They miss each other. Like, these people are in deep relationship with one another,
well,
you know?
So that a few things. It reminds me of my son turned 18 in late May, you know, at which point school had been shut down for a month or two. And it was his 18th birthday. It was like, we got to do something. So we did a family thing, but then we're like, okay, why don't you just have a couple of your really close friends over? You can be in the backyard, you can social distance, we'll make some food, just have a little celebration of your 18th birthday. Well, 2-3 hours later, there's like 15 boys in the backyard wrestling with each other, you know, and like it didn't take long, and then they're not drinking or anything. Like there's nothing bad going on, but they just couldn't not touch each other. They couldn't not be around each other, and it was kind of cute and kind of terrifying. And none of them came down with COVID, but it was actually really beautiful in a certain kind of way. But it wasn't about rule breaking. It was just about they missed each other and they wanted to be around each other. And the other thing I want to name as I hear about everything that's going on college campuses is just how much all of this is motivated by money. How much of this is financially motivated? You know, Dave, you named it, right? Like, we can't tell these kids not to come back to Charlottesville when they've all signed leases, you know, for these apartments. And like, it's like Charlottesville doesn't want them to come back, but I guarantee the landlords want them to come back, and the restaurant owners want them to come back, and the tax base wants them to come back. And then I also wonder, with all these really heavy-handed proclamations by school administrations, how much of it is real and how much of it is just to guard themselves against being sued later on, you know, where they're like, you know, hey, you know, someone's going to get corona and they're going to die, or they're going to have lasting health effects, so we don't know, but at least we can go back and say, look, here's what we said, here's what we told, here's the measures that we took to kind of guard ourselves financially. And maybe that's really cynical, but I just kind of think it's true too, right? Like, these colleges are businesses and they're trying to guard the bottom line. And I don't know. It's an impossibly weird time. I just feel bad for these kids, and I feel bad for the administrators too. Like, what are these? I mean, I guess a lot of places just have shut down, but that's no fun either.
Well, here they're inviting community members to post on like when they see students violating.
Oh my gosh, community policing. Great.
And I thought to myself,
Perfect.
we're already.
That'll go well.
You really want us to police the kids? I mean,
It's so sad.
and that's a role I'm not willing to especially take as the Christian minister. I don't want to be the heavy. But Sarah, it reminded me something that you've written that it's going to go up on the site right after this podcast. Actually, I don't want to blow the title. I want to let you say it. So can you give us a little example?
Sweet. So we had this picture that went up with our, like, you know, my husband's church with his like weekly newsletter. And I immediately saw when it got posted on social media that this woman whose name I did not recognize, I think the sentence started, what do you people think you're doing? And then she ranted at us, and then she tagged my husband, and then she tagged our bishop because, like, he's our dad. I don't know. And the photograph was, so we were talking about Laura hurricane relief and the, you know, ways we were going to be helping. But the photograph was from when we did Harvey, because Harvey impacted our community obviously so much. And anyway, she was livid because it was of a bunch of people in a room packing, you know, food. And there was no, for her, there was no nuance that this might be an old photograph. There was no, you know, reaching out to send an email. It was immediately shaming the church, which she does not
They
attend.
weren't wearing masks in the photo.
They weren't wearing masks, obviously, because this was Harvey. This is pre-pandemic. And she tagged my husband, and it was just awful. And I got really angry and wanted to find her address and key her car. And then I realized just how much my rage really kind of met her rage. And this phrase, I was literally driving around thinking about this phrase came into my head, which is that I need to defund my inner police. And it's a phrase I've been thinking about a lot, because I think we're all, I mean, goodness, Dave, I mean, talking about defunding your inner police, that you would be responsible for reporting students on campus who aren't following protocol, like that we all have this sort of inner legalism right now that is getting a tremendous amount of funding from our deep-seated neuroses and need to be self-righteous. And, you know, I want to decrease so Christ would increase. I mean, I just know it's not good for me. So anyway, I'm working on a piece about that. But
defund your inner police. I mean, that is such. I think we can print that on bumper stickers and not look back, because that's what is really going on. And that's what's so funny, is that sometimes the people who are the most intensely pernicious and overbearing about this about rule following right now are the very ones who are also crying to actually defund the police in other ways. And you're like, I guess, is that, do you just want to become the police to everyone you meet, and that's not.
It's very complicated, and I do know that in using that phrase that I sort of enter into the complications. But I think on either side of politics, there, especially the most extremes, there is this sense of, that we get to say that you're wrong and that we're right, and there's zero like introspection happening. And that's, it's so deeply dangerous. Yeah. So anyway, and I say that as someone who can easily step into that fray. That comes very naturally to me. That is my predilection. But I worry, I really worry. And it was interesting to have someone who was like further left than I am come at me or come at my church or come at my husband. And then my response was immediately violent, frankly, and we're seeing in our streets right now that, right? We're seeing that kind of violence play itself out. I mean, people are literally like showing up to fight each other right now. Yeah. And it's terrifying, but it's also very clarifying to recognize that impulse in myself.
Sarah, what's interesting about that is I agree with you about defunding the inner police, but sometimes the inner police are directed outwards and sometimes they're directed inwards. Totally. Right? Like if I had written the newsletter that Josh had written and gotten the email from the angry woman, I would have been like, how could I have been so stupid to post a picture that didn't, do you know what I mean? And not that Josh was stupid. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it's such an anxiety-ridden time. I think it's a combination, right? We look outside and we say, I can't believe those people are doing that. But then there's also a real sense of internal struggle. Like, am I doing the right things? Am I communicating the right things? How am I handling this? How am I... am I being a good father, a good husband, a good employee, a good whatever it is, that the volume on the internal police, internally directed is also turned up, not just externally, but internally as well.
Yeah.
Well, and I have to say, I totally agree. My fury as his wife, and it wasn't an email, it was a Facebook comment. So it was like everyone could see.
I hate that. Yes. Oh, yeah, totally.
It was pretty awful. And he didn't, somebody on his staff who does communications did the photograph. And so there was a defensiveness around his staff. I mean, it was just really hard. Yeah. And all I could think of as his wife is that article that I read a few weeks ago. It was in a Baptist publication, but it totally applies about how much suicide ideation is up among
I thought
clergy.
About the same thing. Yeah.
I was like, lady, what are you doing? This is hard enough. He already looks tired, So, but I'm not going to key anybody's car because I have, understood that I'm a sinner saved by the grace of Jesus Christ. I'm not allowed to do that anymore.
No, well, when everyone gets deputized, everyone also suffers because a lot of people's internal condemnation also, it has a funnel outward, I think, as well as inward. And as you said,
we're all Barney Fife, but like a really angry Barney Fife.
And it's,
you know what I mean? When we get deputized.
And it definitely cuts both ways. I mean, it depends on which form of the law you're trying to enforce. But right now, there's like a general license has been given to deputize all of these people on social media where there's no actual physical, interaction with someone. So you're removed from them, so the cost is very low, and the reward of feeling good and that you've done something moral is very high, and it's. No wonder the social fabric is fraying in the ways that we're talking about with all of that mental health stuff.
The demand and the need to do everything perfectly right now, right? Whether you're on a college campus, to socialize perfectly, to wear your mask perfectly, to wash your hands perfectly, to, if you're leading a church, to make sure that you're disinfecting perfectly, that you have the perfect regathering plan. It just, the anxiety is so high.
One false move.
Yeah, it's intense. It is intense.
Well, let's shift a little bit here. We're gonna read something that Tim Kreider wrote, which is has something to say about this. On Medium, Tim Kreider, the columnist who we enjoy so much, he wrote a piece called "I Am a Meme Now." And he's referring to one of his more famous lines that we've quoted before. If we want the rewards of being loved, we have to submit to the mortifying ordeal of being known. It's a great little line, and people have memed it in a funny way. And the article is Tim sort of coming to terms with what that means, and he sort of says we're all memes right now. And but he goes to something that's much more universal for those who don't have their little pithy sayings embroidered on either digitally or in actual needlepoint. He says the things people love about you aren't necessarily the things you want to be loved for. Other people decide they like you for reasons completely outside your control, of which you're often not even conscious. It's certainly not because of the big act you put on, all the charm and anecdotes you've calculated for effect. And if your act does fool someone, it only makes you feel like a successful fraud and harbors some secret...
Dave, I feel personally attacked right now, but keep reading.
It only makes you feel like a successful fraud and harbors some secret contempt for them, the contempt of a con artist for his mark. Plus, now you're condemned to keep up that act forever, lest she realize.
Oh my God, this is too much. Okay, keep going.
You don't even get to know what your children will remember you for. It probably won't be what you thought were the important moments. I still remember my dad snoozing next to me in the theater at a long, slow science fiction movie I was keen to see when I was 12. It still touches me to imagine how little interest he must have had in the film. He probably would not have wanted to be immortalized in his sleep, but there he is, snoring gamely beside me. He continues, but as the Velveteen Rabbit teaches, we don't become fully real except in other people's eyes and in their affections. At some point, you have to accept that other people's perception of you are as valid as, and probably a lot more objective than, your own. This may mean letting go of a false or outdated self-image, including some cherished illusions of unique unlovability. For years, I felt guilty and fraudulent every time my girlfriend called me a good boyfriend, until eventually I realized she'd actually made me one. This is, I think, what struck me is a couple of things. First of all, if you're in the business of writing or speaking, or if you're especially preaching, we've talked about this before, but the things that people connect with about your sermon or about, it's usually... It's sometimes just their own biochemical, well-being that day or what they had for lunch, but sometimes it's just the Holy Spirit. And it's seldom what you really want, that what you think is most important for them to get out of your talk, what you really want to communicate to them. They come up to you and they say something and you're like, I didn't actually say that. Or they'll say, I'll never forget the time that you told such and such. And I think, I have no recollection of that.
I always think, don't listen to me whenever people say that.
But that's usually But in fact, it's usually good news because they heard something. If God was involved, they heard something that they needed to hear. And yet, it's frightening to us that we can't really control our image because we spend all day, every day, trying to do that. And yet, we know in our hearts that the way we associate other people and what we think of them has very little to do with their own program for impression making. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of how I've always tried to think of myself as somebody like wants to really have it together, like show up in professional settings, look professional, have the work, all this stuff, and how part of it was just like sheer apathy about school as a kid, but I think about in seminary when I had, all these major life transitions happening as a young mom. I was still really working very hard to try to project that. But the reality was I had no time to do the reading. I was barely making it to class. It was really hard. And the feedback that I got from my classmates was always, and I realized this very quickly, and I've said this before on here, but I realized I was the person they came to when they didn't want to do stuff. Because that was apparently what I was projecting. Like when they wanted someone to say, it's okay, you don't have to do that. Don't go to that. I wouldn't go to that. Don't do that. I wouldn't do that. I was the person they came to. And that's continued actually. Like even now, colleagues will be like, I don't feel like doing this. I'm like, don't do it. And it's a weird thing for me in my life. I feel like God has done where, and I know this is like murky territory, especially for like the type A personalities, but I feel like there's a lot of grace there. Like I kind of like love that, like that's how like I resented it for a little while because I was like, I work so hard to look like I have my shit together. And at some point I was like, I obviously don't have my shit together and I obviously don't show up for stuff that I don't want to. And people seem to find some like mercy for themselves in that. And so, you know, I had a student this summer who got this like baller internship and she didn't show up for a lot of our stuff for like a whole month, which was fine. And she sent me an email and she's like, I'm really, you know, I feel so bad. I promise I'm going to be there this fall. I mean, Dave, you get these emails, right? I promise I'm going to be there this fall. And I was like, it's all grace. Like, it's all grace, you know? And so that has like, I'm actually not, you know, going to be the person people come to for like high achievement, and that's okay. You know, I don't know.
I think it ties into a lot of stuff we've talked about around identity, right? That we're an identity obsessed culture who we want to be able to define ourselves. We want to be able to define someone else. We want to be able to sort of carve out a niche for ourselves in the universe and say, I am this thing, you know, whatever that thing might be. And at the moment we think we have that, it seems to escape us. It seems to fade away, right? Like you only feel as good of a writer as the last piece you wrote, or as good of a preacher as the last sermon you preached. I don't want to say I've given up on that because that's ridiculous, right? Like I wish I could give up on that, but sometimes life gets so full and so crazy and so conflicted that maybe you just care a little bit less. And also the experience of preaching sermons into a camera lens for the last 5 months is bizarre, you know, because there's no immediate reaction. There's no laughing. There's no head nodding. There's no eye contact. There's no words at the church door as you leave, you know. You just kind of put it out there into the cyberspace and you have no idea what kind of effect it's going to have on people as they're sitting in their living rooms or kitchens or whatever. What I have found, interestingly, is that the sermons I'm most nervous about and fearful about seem to have gotten the quote-unquote best reactions. You know, when I feel like I'm talking about something heavy or dark, or, you know, I gave a sermon on sadness last week, which got a lot of views. People seem to really relate to, but it's a very bizarre. Anyway, this is all the piece to me right now. I thought I had a different reaction to the Kreider article. I love the parts that you read, Dave, but I also, you know, he goes on to kind of lament for the youth of today and their reliance on meme culture and online interactions. And I actually had a different reaction, whereas, and maybe this is just my son, but my son and his friends actually do seem to have a level of intimacy, you know, like the birthday party where they were, you know, couldn't keep their hands off each other. And these are all boys, by the way, 100% boys, no girls there.
Yeah.
Seem to have a level of intimacy and understanding, and also just a comfort with online culture. Like they understand it and put it in context way better than I ever could. Like there have been a few times I've had conversations with Jack about things going on with the quote unquote youth of today that concern me. And he's just like, yeah, Dad, I totally understand what you're saying. And like, it's just not that big of a deal. It's not really like that. And I'm like, oh, okay. That's good to know. So maybe I'm 44 years old, which, wait, am I 44? Yes. I forgot how old I was at the grocery store this week. I told the lady I was 42 as she's looking at my ID, which, yes, I got carded. So let me just put that out there. I was wearing a mask, which helps. It was a 2020 moment. She's like, how old are you? Like, I'm 42. Wait, no, I'm 43. I'm like, wait, what year is it? What month is it? I'm actually 44 as she's looking at my ID. Anyway, I don't know. I have more faith in our kids than maybe Kreider does. And maybe I'll feel differently once he's spent a couple of years in college, but I don't know. Meme culture, I don't understand it, but my son does, and he's fine with it. And there's
I think there's a lot of humor and top drawer humor going on in meme culture, and that should be applauded. I really think it's made everyone into a kind of a cartoonist and it's given access to those
and the
skills
synthesis
to a lot
that
of
it creates, the way that people bring in disparate, you know, politics and humor and pop culture and highbrow culture, and the way they all can mix together in a single. It's kind of fascinating. I'm totally intimidated by it, but I think it's art. It actually is art.
It is. I think it's something that's kind of should be actually generally applauded. What it freaks me out, I mean, when one of the things he's saying is that who you are is kind of out of your hands. And that is scary when you put the wrong picture in the newsletter and everyone says, that's the guy who did that is. And like, he's terrible. Or it can be you can be remembered for a single thing in the eyes of people that don't really know you and have not even curiosity. They're just after the reward of feeling right or enough. But the deeper, more gracious thing is that if we're really who we are is not really in our hands, that means the people that love us can love us not for what we project, but who we actually are, or the cracks that get through our facade. I was struck this week. My nostalgia has been well documented on this podcast, but I was going through a old journal I found of mine, which is a very cringe-inducing thing to read what you were thinking when you were 22.
If you had a pizza while you were doing
There's pizza stains all over it.
Just crying. I was just struck by some of the narrative that I have of myself and what I was going through at that time isn't really totally true. It's like I'd edited out certain details and I'd made, it was around the time of my real, I would call it my conversion to Christianity. And you have a shorthand for these things that get to be very clean, and partly just so you can pass it on and other people can maybe benefit from what you have to say. And there's elements that are true. But I would say a lot of the timeline was messier than I realized. And it was kind of a shock to the system. And yet to know that I'm not actually loved or valued according to my own ability to craft a coherent narrative, but something deeper than that, which accounts for my, in fact, fallibility and tireless attempts to assert my lovability. And it was something that was shocking that then turned into something a little bit more comforting. So
it makes me think so much, and I feel for clergy who are single, and anyone who's frankly like in a helping profession that's single, or a profession that's public, because I do think there's, for me, this innate comfort in knowing that no matter how like much I screw up, and or get turned into something that I feel like I'm not or am not out in the world, like when I'm home, I'm loved. I've always been really thankful for that. I mean, it's funny, Josh has had, especially men, ask him, especially progressive men, and progressive men make me anxious because they always are like hiding stuff. I mean, they're not always hiding stuff, but you know what I mean? They're like all on board with women's ordination, but like then they have all these thoughts that they won't say, right? Like, because they're like, oh no, we affirm it, but they haven't done the work.
They're editing themselves a lot.
They're editing themselves, and they have asked my husband before, like, what's it like? I mean, she's a lot, like, what's it like for you? And he's like, she's my wife. Like, what are you talking about? But it's like, I don't know. I'm so grateful for him because he grounds me in like who I actually am, and that I'm loved just for like existing, right?
Bathrobe Sarah, not
bathrobe Sarah. I have been that our whole marriage. I will put a bathrobe over a full outfit if I'm cold enough. So yeah, I mean, not all progressive men are sketchy, but you guys know what I mean.
Yes, I think actually I do know what you mean.
Conservative men are sketchy too. All men are sketchy. Does everyone feel better? Okay, keep going, Dave.
Well, speaking of left-right divides, this is an article that appeared in The Spectator, which is an English newspaper, and it's by Theo Hobson, which kind of cut both ways in a way that I was not expecting. And the title is "Racism is a Sin, and We Are All Sinners." And the sort of tagline is that the current resurgence of debate about racism shows that we still need the concept of sin. He talks about the ways in which the sort of especially the Black Lives Matter movement has has some religious elements to it. And if you've watched the videos of people kneeling and repenting, you know what we're talking about. But he writes this. He says, when secular movements ape religion, they create something narrower than the original. By putting huge emphasis on one form of immorality, modern movements create a dubious division between the pure and the impure. It implies that people who are free of racism, either because they are its victims or because they ardently side with its victims, are morally superior in a general way. This is where old-fashioned religion is crucially wiser. It says that we are all sinners, even if we zealously uphold this or that aspect of morality. Even if we do no discernible outward harm, we are prone to wrongdoing. We gravitate to it. Our hearts are not pure. In theory, at least, this realism dampens the zeal of religious moralists. It reminds them that they share the same sort of impulses that result in the immorality they condemn in others. And yet, to the zealot in our current time, this sounds evasive and complacent. Saying that on some level we are all guilty is just a way of saying that nothing much needs to change, isn't it? No, actually. A quick glance at history shows that most of the main abolitionists and anti-racism campaigners simultaneously believed that racism was a sin and that they themselves were sinners. Isn't that a contradiction? No, because they saw sin as wider than any particular moral evil. They saw slavery and racism as manifestations of human sin that must be opposed, but also saw that the root cause of the problem would stubbornly remain, for human beings are greedy, proud, tribal, and hungry for any claim to superiority that is available. It is naive of the BLM zealot to say that we must be definitively anti-racist, and it leads to an ugly self-righteousness. We will be tempted to prove our goodness by accusing others of evil. And it is naive of the affronted conservative to deny that he or she carries any significant trace of racism, or to pretend that all the fault lies in the excess of the zealots. Only the language of sin allows us to be at all honest about racism. We ought to admit that it is a major moral evil, a sin. And we also ought to admit that it is a manifestation of the general human capacity for evil that none are free from.
It's good. It's encouraging in a strange kind of way.
But that's the pushback often you get when you talk about when you say, well, we're all sinners. People say, well, that's what people have always said, or that's complacency. And
well, it's like,
I'm sure
it seems like thoughts and prayers aren't enough.
Yeah, I'm sure it can be. It can be a use. We can use it to justify ourselves, to be complacent. And yet, in and of itself, I'm not sure. Though what he's trying to say is the statement actually isn't necessarily a complacent one. It's one that can name the evil without placing oneself above others, in a way that sets up a kind of a renewed cycle of blame and recrimination. And I've been struck throughout all of this because, when we talk about racism and prejudice as inherited bias and systemic injustice and all these things that we sort of inherit, it does feel like the way that Christians talk about sin. It's not necessarily in your control. It's not something you can by sheer effort of will just cure yourself of. I remember what was it the other day? One of this black athlete had said some very mean things about Jewish people, and there was a woman, another black journalist, writing about him for The Atlantic and saying, well, it turns out that just because you've been a victim of systemic bias and oppression does not mean that you're not capable of it yourself. And you're like, ding, ding, ding. It's surprising that needs to be said. And yet it seemed almost shocking that she had to report that there is something in the human DNA that tends to gravitate towards these, using other people for our own betterment. I don't know. I'm just talking here. What do you guys think?
Well, it's, when you talk about sin, what we believe it, but what I think actually is also true is that the only solution to sin is, repentance and forgiveness, right? Is coming clean, telling the truth, and being forgiven, which does not lead to, or maybe ever, to improvement, or certainly not immediate improvement. And yet there is something about forgiveness, something about love and grace and mercy, which does begin to, wiggle its way into someone's heart and transform them, right? Like, it's sort of the Tim Kreider thing.
It puts it in God's hands.
Well, it does. And so that's what I was going to say, is that we live at a time when repentance feels, and I'm not sure this is always true, but it can feel impossible because the accusation is so huge, is so massive, that you can't actually come forward and say, well, yeah, I guess I I guess I am kind of a racist. I guess I do have these, these innate biases. I do, because, to be called a racist, to admit you're a racist means, to be at risk of being sort of canceled, outcast. So there's no room for repentance. And then our culture, as the article says, seems to have given up on forgiveness, right? Because, well, forgiveness doesn't work. Empathy doesn't work. Understanding doesn't work. We need concrete solutions. We need things to be changed now. That the answer is sort of power and not love. And I think you're right, Sarah, that there's also this faith element, right? That repentance and forgiveness means trusting something bigger than ourselves is at work, which is why so many of those abolitionist leaders and anti-racist leaders believed in something bigger than themselves. Whether they were Christians or Muslims or Jews or whatever, they believed that they were on the side of a benevolent force that actually had more power than they did. So, yeah, I mean, is our culture capable? Is secular culture capable of adopting an idea like sin when it doesn't create room for honesty and it doesn't believe in the power of forgiveness and doesn't have faith in something larger than ourselves that actually is working for our good, even when we seem to be so self-sabotaging?
I want to say, we've been here before. We have been through a lot of this same conversation with people like Aziz Ansari.
Yes.
Meaning we've been in a place where, because we don't have a concept of sin in our country culturally right now, because we are dependent on a kind of self-improvement religion all the way around, there's no concept for doing things wrong. And because there's no concept for doing things wrong, there's no real concept for forgiveness. So even when people do apologize, they don't apologize enough, right? I mean, that's real, right? I mean, RJ, I appreciate what you're saying about people sort of coming out and saying that they're racist and saying they're doing the work. I mean, that gets a positive response, which in and of itself is a little dark for me, because I don't know what any of that means. I don't know what the positive response means. I don't know what doing the work really means. It's all sort of people motivated, and there's nothing higher than us, bigger than us coming in from the outside. And so that always, I'm like, I hope that's working for you, but I hope the Holy Ghost is at work in you. That's what I'm hoping for in this. I think we need to make sin great again. I do. I think we should all be I just think sin should get back in the pulpit, get it back in. Because it's not just America's not talking about sin. The church doesn't talk about sin, generally. And so no one really has the capacity or language for that. It's even coming into college ministry, that's a really hard concept for young people, to talk about sin, because for them, that's this old antiquated word their grandmother used. And yet then there's no context for redemption. Yeah. Right. And so how do we kind of, as Christians, how do we handle that? I don't know. I love this article because I do think it's a good reminder for us as Christians that the anti-slavery, anti-racism movement has been from the very beginning driven by the Holy Spirit. Mm. And that a massive part of that movement in its original form was to admit that we are sinful, and that God can change us. But that we probably can't. And so I think that's a major thing for us to remind ourselves of right now.
Yeah, I think I just concur. I think it's I would love for us to recover some sense, because Simeon says.
Why did I concur?
No, Simeon, my little brother Simeon, when he gave that talk about hiding in plain sight, he said that when most people today hear a Christian talk about original sin, or just sin in general. What they hear is it's okay to judge people for things that they can't control or their shortcomings, and that's what that could be. I mean, there's what we're
Got the chill bumps.
that's what people hear. So they're against sin because it sounds sinful.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
self-righteous. And in
Yeah.
fact, what we're talking about here is is a leveling of the playing field, and admission of core vulnerability and thoroughgoing weakness that binds us one to another and allows us to work for justice and work for without becoming basically pharisaical is the word for it, and monstrous, because that's what he's sort of pointing out, that it is ironic that conservatives should be able to embrace this understanding that we're all racist because they believe that technically that we're all sinners, but then progressives need to embrace the fact that this is not that their self-righteousness is a sin too, that there's not just individual sins, but there's something called sin, which is like a condition, and
Which next level means you're a sin.
next level means
You know
you're a
what I
sin.
mean?
Exactly.
Like,
And so it doesn't fit in either ideological category right now. I think it in fact transcends them in a very powerful way. And this is part of what we mean when we talk about low anthropology, that if you don't expect people to be anything other than what they are, well, then you can love them, and that you can also not be totally undone when they fail to, when the students all have coronavirus on day 7.
Yeah.
You can say, well, how can I then love this person, rather than just come at them with nothing but blame and finger wagging and punitive measures, which is really going to make them want to never talk to you again and ever about anything. So, RJ?
But that approach, the thing that's so hard is that everyone believes in that approach because it does seem to work. That anger, accusation, victimization, it seems to work. In the wider culture, when you look at people who get elected and the voices that are the loudest and the people that get the most press, and even my wife and I watched Boys State last night. Have you guys watched that?
No,
I
I heard. Yeah. I heard a great review.
It was really good, and it all takes place in Texas. It sort of made me, maybe love Texas more. But it's about an election that happens as part of this American Legion program, and the most compelling, most honest figure, the one you want to know more about, he ends up losing. And one of the reasons he ends up losing is because his opponent employs anger and obfuscation and victimization and all these classic, and they're teenagers, but they recognize what works. And I think there's been a loss of faith on both sides of the political spectrum in humility and empathy, in truth-telling, because that's exhausting, and it's not sexy. And it's the subversion of power, and it means telling. I don't know. It's a sad moment right now. And even as I say that, you hope that even though that's not what you're seeing on the news, it is happening in interpersonal relationships. That conversations are happening, and that there are glimpses of hope which poke through. Is it Dennis Davis? Is that his name? Who spoke at the
Daryl
What was the name of the guy? Daryl Davis. That's where the real work is happening. That's where the real transformation is happening, even though it's not what you're going to see on the nightly news. But yeah, anger seems to work.
Well,
and accusation.
It works to shut people up. I don't think it works to change anyone's heart, and that's what one of the reasons he's saying. That's behind the anti-racism movement is that the laws keeping people's actions in check aren't enough. We want their hearts to be changed too, and that's, I think, a very worthy desire. And yet, what we also know is that yelling at people just doesn't change their hearts. It may get them to stop doing some things like shooting fathers in the street, but it at the same time it doesn't always have the effect of changing someone's attitude and softening their stubborn, self-justifying, idolatrous, sinful heart. But that doesn't mean that can't happen, and it does happen. I mean, we read that incredible story about John Lewis and his and that KKK guy. That was very hopeful to me.
The one person who ever apologized.
Well, remember, Jesus, heals the 10 lepers and only one comes back, right? I mean,
I know.
Let's end with this on kind of to take this a little further with some practical steps, which we don't really do. Is Todd Brewer posted this week on Mockingbird a 12 steps for the recovering Pharisee. It's taken from a book with the same name. I've never even heard this book, but these steps are golden. You guys ready? Step
Yeah.
1. We admit that our single most unmitigated pleasure is to judge other people. Step 2. We have come to believe that our means of obtaining greatness is to make everyone lower than ourselves in our own mind.
100%.
Step 3. We realize that we detest mercy being given to those who, unlike us, haven't worked for it and don't deserve it.
Yeah.
Step 4. We have decided that we don't want to get what we deserve after all, and we don't want anyone else to either. Remember, this is a progression. Step 5. We will cease all attempts to apply teaching and rebuke to anyone but ourselves. Step 6, we are ready to have God remove all these defects of attitude and character. Now that hews exactly to the 12 steps of AA. Step 7, we embrace the belief that we are, and always will be, experts at sinning. Step 8, we are looking closely at the lives of famous men and women of the Bible who turned out to be ordinary sinners like us.
Yes.
Step 9, we are seeking through prayer and meditation to make a conscious effort to consider others better than ourselves. Step 10, we embrace the state of astonishment as a permanent and glorious reality.
Ugh.
Step 11, we choose to rid ourselves of any attitude that is not bathed in gratitude. Step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we will try to carry this message to others who think that Christians are better than everyone else.
That's so good.
That was a nice, pithy way of talking about. I mean, it's really a program for not just recovering Pharisees, but recovering human beings.
Yeah.
And all of us in this moment who are so tempted to be self-righteous about, even to be self-righteous about self-righteous people, I find that especially that one about we will cease all attempts to apply teaching and rebuke to anyone but ourselves. That's, at least when it comes to a lot of the big ones, it's very difficult to listen to certain people talk about it, as we've seen, like with the Jerry Falwell thing this past week. This is not theoretical.
Right.
This is the heart of the faith is the bathed in gratitude and moving outward from that humility, because gratitude really only occurs to the person who's been humbled or at least received something.
That I've had, I know you don't want to talk about the Jerry Falwell thing, but
I don't care.
we don't need to spend too much time on it, but I have to say I've had such a weird reaction to that. And I guess it's because I work with college students. I think if I didn't work with college students and I haven't come to know and to love them this past year, maybe I would be more callous. I think I probably would have been like, hey, you know what I mean? Like, those conservatives. And I just hear these students talk about how heartbroken they are about the state of their university and the leadership. And I feel so much compassion for them. I don't know. It's just so, I imagine like being a freshman at that school right now and like they're so, and I can be critical of it very easily, but there's so much like beautiful sort of moral, earnestness, right? And it's just been crushed.
Hope.
And and hope. Like that would be more positive hope. And it's just been crushed. So anyway, I don't know. I just it's so funny when you read this stuff, and I love this 12 steps for the Pharisee stuff. It's always easy for me to think about who people are who are Pharisaic, and it's definitely not me, because I don't have.
I know who really needs to read this list.
Right, exactly. Like those people are the Pharisees, and then something like the thing happens that happened at Liberty University, and because God has moved my heart so much to love college students, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like feel for them so deeply, in a way that I didn't expect. So anyway, I don't know.
I will say college is a great time to learn about the reality of sin in your own life. I think
Those babies are getting a 101 up at Liberty University this year.
but that's not even their personal sin. That's someone else's sin.
Yeah,
I think David was your dad who said,
yeah.
that people go to college to make mistakes. That's the reason you go to college, is to make mistakes, and to learn, to be sort of set free, to learn the truth about yourself. And I think especially if you're a Christian, I mean, speaking of a personal experience, I think when I entered college, I thought I kind of had my act together, and then I came out the other side and realized that nothing could be further from the truth. And a lot of that was my, having the freedom to make some mistakes. So,
Well, that's one of the things that we've, the college students have been hated on without any mercy or hesitation for forever, but especially these last 10 years with, the activism and the entitlement and the millennialism,
snowflakes, microaggressions,
all that stuff. It's very easy to roll your eyes, but you want to say, well, weren't you 19 once and making? You need to have This used to be, you weren't on a national stage because by virtue of social media, but this is the time when you put your foot in it, and you did some things that people can then bring up at your wedding to say, oh, let me tell you what he did in college. And today we were talking about, RJ, earlier about the law out there, the free floating accusation of you must, respond correctly. You must wash your hands correctly. You must, is one false move.
Perfectly. Not correctly, but perfectly.
As a church, you must be absolutely attentive to the needs of those who cannot come on Sunday, and absolutely attentive to those who who insist that you come. It's there in college too. And as we know, as one of that commenter said, it's going to just drive these things behind closed doors, but more deeply, I think you see it reflected in that statistic that we mentioned last week that the CDC said of the suicidal ideation among 25 or I think 18 to 25-year-olds is something like a quarter have seriously considered killing themselves. And that happens when life is overwhelming. It happens with physiological imbalances, but it really happens when you have no hope of things getting better, or if knowing what you're like or what you want to do or who you really are, you have no hope that those things could ever be forgiven or accepted, because you've so been bathed in the mercilessness that seems to be taking all of us captive. So I guess these steps.
Or when you put your hope in the wrong things, when you put your hope in people, institutions, they're going to disappoint you. Yeah. Which is that's part of the learning process too, is learning what can bear the weight of your hope. And at the end of the day, we only think there's one person who ever lived who can bear that.
Yeah. One person who took on the hurricane of human sin.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, well, that's probably a good place to leave it. I hope that we can get into a slightly more regular schedule now that life has begun, but who knows? We're going to try. There's so many variables right now in terms of our lives, but we're so glad that you're listening, and we cannot wait to talk again in a couple weeks. Thank you both. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by TJ Hester. And if you like what you've heard, please do drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. Until next time.
Praise the Lord.